Hey guys, thanks for stopping by the channel. As you saw, the wood for the stringers came in, and I do have the wood for the transom in. The whole of the boat is prepped. That means it's time to finally cut these new stringers and get them installed. Now before we go ahead and install these stringers, there's a couple things I want to talk about. There's a couple things I want to cover on the wood itself. There's also a few things on the boat that I like to cover, kind of along the lines of how I plan to find the center point and get these stringers set and mounted up. But we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, let's talk about wood. For my stringers, they're 16 feet long, and I chose to go back with something dimensionally the same as what came out, which was a 2x6. And I'm using clear vertical grain Douglas fir. So it's the two boards up there at the top. I happen to have this other board here at home, and that's just a standard board that you can get at your local Home Depot or Lowe's. And I thought it'd be a great chance to lay it next to these other boards and show you the difference. So the clear vertical grain, it has requirements on the amount of knotting per foot on them. And also, if you notice on the end of the boards, the grain pattern is cut quite a bit differently than your standard big box store board. So what this will do for me is this wood has a lot more strength. It's also a lot more stable, so it's less likely to warp, bow, or cup. And I can tell you, just if you look at these boards, I'm pretty sure the camera's not going to show it up, but this board is what you'd expect from a big box store where it's far from straight, and these two boards are pretty nice and straight. Now, at today's lumber prices, I paid about $140 per board here, and that was about $20. So there's absolutely a big price difference, but I've put so much work into this boat, and it's taken so much prep and time and money and fiberglass to get it to where I'm at. I'm not stopping short. I'm going to go ahead and use the better, more superior lumber because I want this repair to be permanent and last a long time. I really don't want to have to come back and do this job again. Now you can see this is the old starboard or passenger stringer that came out of the boat, and I was able to pull all the fiberglass encasement off of it, and it's actually pretty good. It's in decent shape. It's at least good enough to pull a template off of on the way that it's cut, and it tapers up to the bow. Unfortunately, on my boat, these stringers were 24 inches apart on the inside dimensions, and I'm going to go ahead and move the new stringers to 26 inches apart. Now, the reason why I'm doing that is it's going to go ahead and give me some more flexibility with engine mounting, and I won't have clearance issues. And also, it's going to help make things a little bit more stable with the wider stringer. The downside of that is it's pretty convenient when you have to put a floor in the boat, and they're 24 inches apart, because you can just get a 4x8 piece of plywood, rip it down the center, and you have enough for your floor. I'm thinking that by the time I go ahead and get my plywood and cut it for the floor, the other half of the plywood that's a little bit shorter, I'm going to be able to go ahead and use those for the bulkheads. So I think in the end, it's not going to cost me any extra lumber, just a little bit of planning on how I'm going to cut my lumber and where I'm going to use it. So let's take a minute and talk about boat prep. Earlier in my videos, I talked about how I put the boat on 3 jack stands, and now that I'm actually to the point where I'm going to install the stringers, I spent quite a bit more time to be sure that the boat was level. Now, I did all of my leveling and measurements from the bottom of the boat, not the inside. The inside of the boat doesn't matter. Everything should be taken from the bottom because that's the part that interfaces with the water. That's really what matters. So I had to raise the rear jack stands up in order to get this boat leveled. And you can see I have just this one orange stand here in the center on the keel. And I used just some door shims to go ahead and get this raised up and finalize my leveling of the boat. On those red jack stands that I have on either side, I mentioned in the previous videos, I only put those there and again added door shims on them to just barely be touching the boat. And I did that because there's no wood in the boat, and when I'm crawling in and out and working in the boat, it really helps stabilize it. Once I go and put these stringers in and have them bedded in, I'm going to go ahead and take those jack stands out so that way it's sitting on a true 3-point jack stand system. The reason why I'm doing this is with the 3-point jack stands is you want to do everything you can to minimize any distortion to the hull, because once you bed these stringers in and tab them in, it would be there permanently. That's why you don't want to do this on a trailer, and that's also why I'm going to pull those extra jack stands I have in out before I go ahead and bed them in. Now, while I was down here, I also took a chalk line and ran it down the center of the bow, and I ran that down the center of the keel all the way to the back of the boat and to the transom. Now, before I ran that chalk line, I went onto the center of the keel on the boat, and I actually measured on either side of the strakes, and I found the center point based on the strakes, and I marked that with blue painter's tape all the way down the boat. So then when I ran that chalk line down the bow line and down the boat, I had a reference point to measure it. So essentially is what I have now is I have a center point going down the keel of the boat, and I was able to take that and bring that, you can see it right back up here. I was able to mark the inside of the floor of the boat where the center line is and where it comes back over the transom. Now on the back side, I was able to pull measurements again off the strakes to the center from either side, and again find the center point of the transom. So with this chalk line, I have the center line of the keel and I have it to the transom, and I'm going to be doing my best to go ahead and install these stringers as center to the boat as I can. Again, not off the inside dimensions, but off the center point of the boat. Now fortunately, up on the keel near where that jack stand is, the gel coat's rubbed pretty raw from the boat going up on sandy beaches. So I was able to see through the fiberglass of the boat with a flashlight. So what I did is I had the chalk line up there on the center point underneath the boat. I put the flashlights on the floor shining up, and I was able to crawl in the boat and see roughly where that line was. So what I'm going to do from there is then go ahead and bring the chalk line to the inside of the boat from the center point up by the keel and match up to these points down here. And that will be close enough where I can use to get these stringers in the boat and centered. If you're enjoying this jet boat rebuild and you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I really appreciate it. It helps me out a lot. For those of you that have already subscribed, you've been commenting, liking the videos, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate the nice comments. It means a lot to me. Keep them coming. Let's get back to the boat. Before running the chalk line on the inside of the boat, I laid down this blue painter's tape. That way I could go ahead and transfer the line with a pen to the tape and not worry about moving the chalk as I work on the rest of the repairs of the boat. Now I taped the chalk line up at the bow from the marks that I could see through of the gel coat, and then I had previously made some marks back on the pump opening that were there from when I ran the string underneath the boat. So I just lined those up, went ahead and snapped the line, and then went back and traced it with a marker. And you can see that when I go ahead and measure it here, I'm about 7 7/8 and just about 7 7/8. Like I mentioned, you don't really want to rely on measuring from the inside of the boat. You know, consider that I've been grinding on this. You don't know how many layers of fiberglass are there, and the inside of the boat doesn't really matter as compared to the part of the boat that's in the water. But that's just a good comparison to be sure that I am true, I am pretty close to center, and all the different measurements that I've taken from underneath the boat, on the back of the transom, and on the inside of the boat all have matched up and aligned. So that tells me that I'm pretty good, I'm pretty centered, and I can use this as a center line to install my stringers. It's not that critical to have your stringers perfectly centered in the boat. I'm doing this just so that way I have a nicer, easier, and more accurate engine placement in relation to the pump. I figure a little bit of time spent here is going to pay dividends in the long run. I figure if I have the stringers fairly accurate and centered, I can also use those to help get the engine centered along with the center line. So in the end, it's a little bit of extra work, but I feel that it's worth it. So from here is what I need to do is go ahead and place the 2 new boards in the boat, and I'm going to come back and show you how I'm going to go ahead and get them traced and marked so I know how to get these cut so they have a nice, good, tight fit. All right, got the stringers in, they're positioned and leveled up and ready to be marked, so that way I know where to cut them so they fit the whole of the boat. But before we go and talk about getting them marked and how to get them to fit, I want to talk a little bit about how I have them positioned and what I did. So, like I mentioned, I moved these stringers so they're 26 inches apart opposed to the 24 inches that I had. Now I did actually move them out a little bit more, just about a 1/4 inch, so that way when I go ahead and tab them in and fiberglass them, the true inside dimension will still be 26 inches. So these boards that I cut to hold them are actually 26 1/4. And it was a little loose on the side, so I just used some door shims to go ahead and hold them tight, and that goes and keeps these boards 90 degrees to the hull of the boat, and it also keeps them pretty sturdy. As you can see, I don't have much movement in this. Now, what I did back here is my 2x6s are a true 5.5 inches tall, so I cut these boards out right here at 5.5 inches. And at the front of the boat, they're resting just straight on the fiberglass. Let's see if we can get a light in there. It's tight to see, but they're just resting on the fiberglass. So what we have essentially is the void underneath the stringers is the actual shape and size of the stringers that I need. You'll also notice that I went ahead and marked the center point of these 2x6s that I have supporting the stringers and holding their distance. And I use those to reference off the center point of the hole right down the keel that I did earlier. And also here on the back of the transom, I had to move the stringers forward because my transom has that 18-degree decline. So if I were to push the stringers back up on the transom, they actually wouldn't fit by the time I would cut them. So what I did is I used a normal carpenter square and I held it up flush on the bottom of the boat, and then I matched up the corner to the transom, and then I just made the corner of the stringers match that plane. I also took the same carpenter square and I ran it off the back of the transom to go ahead and square up the stringers and get them as squared and centered as I could. Now, I did that because that will change how you go ahead and cut these stringers depending on the shape of the boat. So if these stringers are off or crooked or not level, when I trace my line and then cut them, it's going to translate into the cut and I'm going to have a big gap. So I spent the time to make sure that these are as close to the true position they're going to be in, so that way when I mark them, I have a better cut. It's a little bit of extra work going about it this way, but I really wanted to make sure I have a nice, good fit on the first shot. So this is where it was important earlier in this the build when I got this boat leveled, because now the way the stringers are sitting, if I put a level on top of them, they're level, which is matching the level of the boat. Now remember, the boat is sitting on the 3-point jack stands. So I have the one jack stand under the keel, and then I have the two back there on the outside chines. Again, as I mentioned, I have these two red jack stands midway up on either side, and I have those there. They're not putting pressure on the hull. They're just there to avoid deflection when I'm getting in and out of the boat. So the hull is sitting in its natural resting position, and then I also have that floor jack there down on the center of the keel, because when I crawl up in there to mark these stringers, my weight's going to deform the hull, and I don't want that because that's going to change my marking. So I'm leaving those extra jack stands and the floor jack to give the hull, once it deforms, it's going to stop it and it'll be close to its natural resting position with my weight in there while I mark everything. So now we need to go ahead and transfer our marks from the boat to the stringer so we know where to cut them. So I took this piece of wood and I went ahead and rigged up some washers on there so they go ahead and spin. That bolt's just there to space them off. I measured up and drilled a hole at 5.5 inches. I tapered the hole so I can go ahead and set that pencil in. So this piece of wood, I can go ahead and run it down the hull of the boat, and the pencil essentially marks the top of the stringer. Since I have the stringer sitting up 5.5 inches, when I run this pencil down the length of the stringer, it's actually going to mark the bottom of the stringer to where the floor of the boat is. So all I have to do is run this along the floor of the boat like this, and run my pencil down it, and that's going to go ahead and give me my cut line all the way on the stringer. Now I need to do this on both sides because the floor of the boat rolls in, so the inside is going to be a little bit deeper, and we'll address that when we go ahead and cut it to get it fit. But for now, I need to set the camera down, and I need to go ahead and mark both sides of these boards all the way up into the bow. When making my marks on the stringers, I'm being very mindful not to add any weight to the hull of the boat and not to cause any deflection. You can see that I'm making all the marks from the outside, and then I hopped in where the pump sits and made the marks on the inside. Now I was limited to the forward intersection of the stringers where I could not do this, so that's where I went ahead and had previously mentioned that I placed the extra jack stands on the outside midpoint of the boat and the floor jack on the center point of the keel. Now neither of those jack stands or the floor jack are adding any pressure to the boat. They're just there to prevent it from dropping down from my weight. Therefore there's no deflection of the boat, and I have a true good shape of the hull while making these marks. Okay, so the stringer's marked and out, and I went ahead and went over the pencil line with a Sharpie so you guys can see it a little bit better on camera. And you can see where the line essentially just tapers and follows right up into the bow of the boat and has a good curve. Now one thing to keep in mind when you go to cut this, as I mentioned, the boat is not flat as it curves. So if I stand this on end and you compare the outside of the stringer to the inside, you can see it's quite a bit of a different shape. So you really need to be careful when you go and cut this, because you have to cut essentially the inside off the inside line first, because that's going to be longer than the outside, and then you need to come back and address that side to give it the shape to lay up flat in the hole. So if I were to go ahead and cut on this outside line first, it would actually cut far too much material off on the inside, and I would never have a good fit. To get the stringer cut, I chose to use a skill saw, and I was cutting off of the inside line by freehand. I left the blade on the skill saw set at a 90-degree angle. Because of the curve of the stringer, it not only curls up and tapers towards the top of the stringer, but it has a taper to the outside. So it's almost like a compound curve on the front section of the stringer. And that curve is actually not consistent as the stringer tapers, so it would be very difficult to match that with one setting of the blade. So I figured it would be easiest just to go ahead and make one initial cut with the skill saw at 90 degrees, and I'll show you how I'm going to address the other sections of the cut here in a second. So you can see I went ahead and cut it with my skill saw, and I left the blade at a straight 90 degree. And now you can see real well how you have to pay attention to which side you're cutting, because if I were to cut off of the outside of the stringer, I would have been 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch too short and essentially ruined the piece of wood. So you can see it's really only up there in the front section of the bow, and then it tapers down. And even though I still have a bit of a line here, there's not much to it. Just a little bit up here, and then it just kind of fades away. So what I'm going to do is I'll probably take a jigsaw and angle the blade and cut this just to get the bulk of the wood away, and then I'll fine tune it with my angle grinder. And for these sections down here, I'll just hit those with the angle grinder, and I'll basically not take any wood off of this outer edge and just take this and bevel it to that shape. And then we'll just do some trial and error fitment into the boat and tweak it as we need. I have this stringer laying on the sawhorses with the outside facing up, and the initial cut that I made with the skill saw was on the inside, and I cut that to my line. So I use trial and error here to get the angle of the blade on the skill saw, and as what I'm doing is I'm cutting the stringer with the line on the outside, being sure that I'm not getting down and cutting any wood off of the other side of the stringer where the cut was made with the skill saw. Once I had that done, I took my 4.5 inch angle grinder and I went ahead and fine-tuned it, basically connecting the two lines and making them flat, giving the wood the angle it needed. Now also up towards the back side of the stringer where the cut was much smaller, I didn't do any cutting there at all, and I just fine-tuned it with the grinder. Once I had everything tuned in with the grinder, I went back with a DA sander, and I had a 24 grit sanding disc on that, and that really just let me fine-tune the angle on the stringers, because with the 4.5 inch grinder, it's pretty aggressive. It removes a lot of material quickly, and it's hard to get a nice smooth, even finish, nice transitions and radiuses. So with the sander, it's easier just to go back and kind of fine-tune it and get what you need. Now once I had that done, I went and set the stringers on the boat, and there was a few adjustments I made with sanding on them just to make sure that there was no high spots that were keeping it high off of the floor, and making sure that the contour of the stringer matched the hull of the boat the closest I could get it. Once I was happy with the fit of the port stringer, I needed to go ahead and repeat this process to cut out and shape fit the starboard stringer to the boat. I did the exact same steps, cut it with the skill saw, trimmed it with the jigsaw, fine-tuned it with the grinder and sander, and did a few test fits in the boats, a few small tweaks with the sanding, and I was pretty much ready to go. Alright, got them cut and installed on the first shot, and the fitment is really good. I'm really happy with it. There's not a big gap on the bottom. It's very manageable, and just the overall fit all the way up into the slope of the bow is very good. It's what I was looking for. So you can see that I went and put these boards back in, positioned them. I got the wedges to hold it tight, and I centered it back up so that way I can confirm the right fit. Because the way the front of the bow moves up, if you move these stringers left or right, that completely changes the way they fit the floor of the boat. So that's why it's really important, even at this step, to make sure they're centered. The more time you spend with that centering, the better fit you're going to have overall. Another thing to keep in mind is the straightness of your boards. My port stringer here, driver's side stringer, that board was very straight, and I didn't have many knots to work around, so it was pretty simple on just putting it in. On the starboard side, passenger stringer, it had a couple knots that I needed to work around. Now, I didn't want to have those knots up in the front by the bow, because as I was cutting that board to make it fit, I'm losing thickness, and then those knots were not going to be able to be cut out, and I was worried about the overall strength of the board. So I felt that it was better to move the board back or flip it around so the knots would be back here, and I was sure that they're out of the engine box area. But because of that, I essentially only had one direction that I could install that board that I liked, and this board actually has a bit of a bow to it. So it's one thing to keep in mind when you're tracing out your boards, because that bow actually goes up rather than the bow down on the way it's installed. So you needed to take that into account when I had everything mocked up and I drew my line on it. But for now, I got them in, test fit's good, so the next steps are to pull them out, get the hole prepped, and get the bottom of these boards prepped before we go ahead and get them put in. Well, it's no surprise that my OCD came and got the best of me on this one. And I went and had the stringers centered up in the boat, and I was doing that measuring off of my center line that I put in earlier. As you can see, I went and took a laser level and I lined it up on my line all the way back to the line back behind the pump and on the transom and up the boat. And I did that because I wanted to make sure that they actually were truly centered in the boat. So, not sure if it picks up the line on the camera here, but it's pretty good and centered. And an added benefit with me having the center line marked on these support boards that I have to hold everything in place is I'm not only confirmed that I'm centered up on the line of the boat and my tape line centered back to the transom, but that center line overlays with the center line of those boards and my stringers are centered. Which, if you look carefully, my gap here from where this floor raises on either side is actually a little bit tighter on the starboard side of the boat. That's why you don't want to rely just on the inside of the boat to set the stringers, because it's not a true dimension that you can rely on. You need to pull everything from the bottom of the boat and then transfer that to the inside to get a true square set of stringers. So before I pull these stringers out and start working on getting them bedded in, one last thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go ahead and mark on the floor of the boat where these stringers sit, so that way when I put them back in and I'm dealing with my fiberglass, I don't have to fight to get them positioned. I can get them 90% of the way there, and I just have to tweak them a little bit left to right to get them centered up and squared in the boat. Just like when I was making my marks on the stringers when I needed to cut them, I put a lot of effort into making sure that I wasn't leaning on the boat or placing any of my weight on it, because I did not want any deflection in the hull. Now, getting most of these marks done on the rear section of the open section of the boat was pretty easy and quite straightforward, honestly, but as you can see, when I start crawling up into the bow, with the support boards that I have in the center, there really wasn't much space at all to work with. It's tight up there anyways, but once I had the support boards and being able to see where I needed the mark and not move the stringers proved to be quite difficult. So I was removing those supports as minimal as I could, just giving me enough space to get up in there and mark them. And then once I had it marked, it was go ahead and fully disassemble everything. So the stringers are out of the boat for what I hope is the last time. And there's a couple things I want to talk about here that I did not mention earlier. And one of those is the radius I put on the tops of these stringers. So I went and hit them with a router with a 1/2 inch just rounded bit and rounded the top. Now I did that before I even cut the stringers. They were still just the raw wood, and that was actually the first thing I did. And the reason why I did that is because once I get these trimmed that fit up into the bow, you can see that it would be pretty much impossible to keep that router flat and get that routed. So if you were to go ahead and do the router work afterwards, you would have to stop short and do that by hand. So it's easier just to do that to start with before you cut the boards. It really has no bearing on the setup and getting everything mocked up. You do have to select which boards you want and which way you want them facing up before you router them. And the reason why we're doing that routering is just to go ahead and give that edge a nice round, smooth, easy transition. And that's going to help with our fiberglass when we go ahead and wrap it over it. If we were to leave it with the original dimensions of the wood, it's hard for that fiberglass to want to make that corner, and it will have a tendency to want to kind of roll up off of the board. So by doing so, it'll be easier to glass it up, and it just looks a little nicer. Now let's talk about water drains. You can see that I placed my water drains as far back as I could, all the way up against the back of the transom. And I did this because I didn't want any water sitting back there whatsoever. And also, if I moved them forward, I felt that it would just leave a weak section of wood there that would eventually break and crack. And if we go out and actually look at my original stringer, you'll see what I'm talking about. You can see back here where they had the water drain, and you can see that it already is cracking, and that crack goes all the way through the wood. And you can actually see that there's quite a bit of water damage back there, I suspect, from this hole. So even if you were able to seal up the inside of that hole, I don't like how it cracked. I don't like how the water got in. So my train of thought with my placement of the drains was, I don't have that wood that's going to crack and break off, and there's just less area there for water to get into, because hopefully the water will sit on the boat and go underneath and not get on the wood. Before I go ahead and place these in the boat and get them fiberglassed in, is what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take the bottom edge and these back edges, and I'm going to go ahead and pre-soak them in the fiberglass resin. I'll do the same thing on the boat, and then I'm going to go ahead and fiberglass them in. I'm using vinyl ester resin to pre-soak the bottom side of the stringers. Now it's important to pay particular attention to the ends of the boards and also the areas where I cut the water drains. I want to be sure that these areas are well protected for potential water ingress, and I really want to be sure that that resin soaks in well in those areas. Just as I did on the stringers, I'm applying a coat of resin to the floor of the boat. Now keep in mind that the fiberglass on the floor of the boat is not going to soak up as much resin as the wood will, so just one coat will be sufficient in this area. After letting the first coat of resin soak into the wood for a little bit, I came back over it with another coat. You'll see the areas where the resin soaks in a little bit more than others, so I focused on those spots first. Then I went back over the entire length of the stringer with one more even coat. I chose to use a pre-mixed fiberglass putty to bed my stringers in. The product that I bought is called Fiber Filler, which I purchased from my local Fiberlay. It's a structural fiberglass putty that is great for this type of work. Now you can make your own mixture of peanut butter to bed your stringers in, or if you choose, you can use PL construction adhesive. If you choose to use PL adhesive, you need to extend your cure time before you start the lamination process of the stringers. You need to allow time for the PL adhesive to fully cure and gas out before you can laminate over it. If you're using a fiberglass putty like I am to bed the stringers, or you make your own peanut butter mixture with fiberglass resin, you don't have to have that same wait time for the cure like you do with PL adhesive. You can go ahead and use those fiberglass based products to bed the stringers in and start your lamination process directly over that. I'm applying this fiber filler in a thick and full layer on the bottom of the stringers. I really want to ensure that I have good coverage once I set them in place. So because of this, I plan on and expect to have a lot of the fiber filler squish out, and in this application I'd much rather have far too much material used than not enough. Now when it comes to bonding the stringers to the hull, it's my preference to have them 100% secured to the bottom of the boat. Some people install them setting them on a few pieces of 1/4 inch foam blocks or some wood shims so that way they can float on the floor. I feel that the stringer needs to be one with the boat. I do not want the stringer to have any movement in relation to the floor of the boat, as I want the bond to be as strong as possible. The fiber filler that I'm using has a 20-minute gel time, so this gives me a very narrow window to mix the fiber filler, get it applied evenly to the bottom of both stringers, and then get both stringers set and positioned into the boat. I had to use lots of planning ahead and quick execution at this point of the job. Once I had the stringers set in the final position, I used what little time I had left before the fiber filler fully kicked off to go ahead and clean the excess squeeze out on the edges and try to make a little bit of a radius where they transition to the floor. Whew, that was a lot of work to get done in a short period of time before that kicked off on me, but it's been a day or two and the stringers are in, cured up, and ready to keep moving forward. Before we go ahead and pull those support boards off, let's talk about the fiberglass that I use to bed them in. Now, what I use is I use this fiber filler here, which is basically almost like a fiberglass putty, essentially. Pretty close equivalent to making your own peanut butter mixture. I chose to go this route simply for convenience. I think I paid just about $100 for this gallon, and I probably have half a gallon left. And this is the same stuff that I'm using to get all my good fillets and radiuses in my corners. So I still will be using more of this along the stringers to finish up the repair, and for all the rest of the wood that goes in the boat, this is what I'll be using. So I ended up using the equivalent of about 24 ounces of this filler, but I had basically these 8-ounce cups. I had 4 of them filled up, and I had my catalyst set aside already rationed out. So I didn't have to have any downtime if I needed to mix more as I was applying it onto the wood. I just went ahead, grabbed another can, catalyst, mixed it, and applied it on. And like I mentioned, I went through 3 of them, so the 4th was extra and it wasn't mixed, so I was able to keep it and retain it for the rest of the boat. So now that I got it all in, everything's cured up, is what I need to do is I need to go ahead and pull these support boards out. I need to get the string out of my way. You can see where I had a lot of that excess fiber filler and resin on the stringers. So I want to go ahead and address that and sand that smooth and off so I have a nicer finish to start with. And also it's been more than the 24 hours, so I need to give it a good scuff before I go ahead and laminate over it. That's definitely not a must, but it's similar to the work I did on the transom. Once I had that all epoxied in, I went back and sanded it and filleted all the corners real nicely and prettied it up, because spending a little bit of time now to get that cleaned up and just addressing those small details makes your fiberglass go on a lot better, and the end result ends up looking a lot nicer. So it's a little bit of extra work, one extra step, but in the end it really pays off. Those little details really make this job come out nice. So more sanding, more dust, get these prepped, and I'll bring you guys back once we go ahead and start getting the tabbing in on these stringers. Here I'm using my 24 grit roll lock disc on my 3-inch die grinder to get the majority of the excess fiber filler off the hull and off of the stringer. I then go back over it with my 6-inch DA and 40 grit sandpaper. An added benefit to using the 40 grit on the DA is that it helps rough the surface of the wood up quite a bit. This will help enable the resin to soak in and penetrate the wood better, hopefully enabling a better, stronger bond and more resistance to water ingress. So I have pretty much the rear section of the stringers all prepped and cleaned up, and I still need to address everything under the bow, but I have a really good example to show you guys of why I'm doing this. And if you look up and in here, you can see how much squeeze out I had. It's pretty significant on that side. So really, once I had my braces in here and I had the stringer set, because the bow's so low and the extra bracing, I couldn't really get in there and work that extra glass out before it cured. So I need to go through and grind it. And you can see that back here I did grind it, and I'm gonna go back and just do a new fillet all the way down once it's cured. I did work this section back a little bit as I put them in, but I was running out of working time and I was working around the boards. It was proven to be pretty difficult to get the finished product I was looking for. It was getting pretty raggedy. But also, if you look up here, you can see that I do have one little void right there in that section. So once I'm done prepping everything, I'm going to go ahead and take more of that fiberglass and I'm going to work it in there as deep as I can to get rid of as much of that void as possible, and then I'll run the fillet on there again. And I got to work that all the way up into the bow and finish getting the sides of the boards prepped. And then finally to that point, I can start getting to the point of laminating these in. So before we go ahead and get the radius on the bottom corners of the stringers to the floor done, I need to go ahead and address the few gaps that I had and get that fiberglass up in there so that way the stringers are fully bedded to the hull. Now what I have planned to do that is I'll go ahead and use more of this fiber filler, and this is the same product that I use to bed in the stringers. And in order to get it in there and ensure that I have good coverage and no voids, I'm actually going to use a piping bag for like decorating cakes. And I went ahead and just kind of reshaped that nozzle so it'll fit in there and be able to squirt and push that in there. Now this filler is actually fairly thick. I'll show you here. There you go. So you can see this filler is fairly thick, and it's going to be pretty hard to go ahead and squeeze that through this bag. When I do catalyze it, it does thin up some, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use some of my laminating resin here, and I'll go ahead and mix that in with this, and that's going to go ahead and loosen it up some, so it'll still be thick enough to hold shape and not run out. But my hope is that it's going to be thin enough to easily squeeze out of this bag, so that way I can make this task quick and not very messy at all. Luckily, these two products here, they use the same catalyst, so I don't have to really worry about that, and the mix ratio is also the same. So I can just go ahead and mix these two together until I get the consistency that I think will work. Then I can catalyze it, go ahead and jump in the boat, and we'll see if this idea works or fails. I'll let you know here in a second. I added the vinyl ester resin to my fiber filler until I had a viscosity that I felt would be workable in the piping bag, but not so thin that it was unable to hold its shape. Once I had the resin and fiber filler mixed to the consistency that I wanted, I was able to determine my final volume to calculate and add the proper quantity of catalyst. Applying the thinned out fiber filler with the piping bag worked out really well. Honestly, it ended up working better than I was initially expecting. I was able to get the fiber filler fully under the stringers and had no problems filling any voids that I came across. You'll notice up under in the bow, I applied some masking tape on both the floor of the boat and the bottom edge of the stringer. Now I did this while I was applying the fiber filler with the piping bag under the stringers because I wanted to be sure that there was no unwanted filler ending up on the stringers or the floor, since I had already sanded, prepped, and cleaned those areas. Once I was finished filling the voids underneath the stringers, I used the excess fiber filler that I had left to create the fillet on the bottom of the stringers. I ran the initial bead of filler with the piping bag, then went back over that with my finger to give it the desired shape. This aids in supporting the stringer to the hole, but more importantly creates a smooth, gradual radius that will make it substantially easier to get the fiberglass to conform to. The 1708 mat that we'll be using does not like to make sharp and sudden transitions. Just like the bottom edge of the stringers, the tops and sides are going to get the same treatment with a pre-soak of the vinyl ester resin. If this step is skipped and you apply the fiberglass directly over the dry wood, you'll end up with a dry layup and poor adhesion. When the glass is applied without pre-soaking the wood, the resin will be absorbed and soak into the wood as it's curing. So you may have applied a good layup and it will look right as you just finished it, but when you come back after everything is cured, you're going to find that the glass is now dry. Pre-soaking the hole in stringers and resin will prevent this from occurring. I chose to use 8-inch wide 1708 biaxial fiberglass cloth to tab in my stringers. Much like the work I did on the transom, I'm laying the cloth on dry, then working the resin in. If you have the opportunity to have somebody help you with these steps, you can have them pre-soak the cloth for you, and then you can focus on the installation. Having someone help you by pre-soaking the fiberglass is going to significantly decrease the installation time of all the tabbing. Since I was installing this alone, it was easier for me to install the cloth dry. Now because I pre-soaked the wood and floor with resin, it was just tacky enough to hold the cloth into place, allowing me to get it set into the desired position. With the 1708 being lightly held in place, it also allows me to make the necessary relief cuts where the stringer, transom, and floor all intersect. I then applied the resin to the cloth with a 2-inch brush. I would go back and forth between the brush and a fin roller to work the resin into the cloth and ensure that I had all of the air out. Now there are several things to consider before determining the lengths of the 1708 that I was installing. I wanted all the areas of seams or where overlapping would take place to be located out of sight once the boat was completely finished. So I targeted to have the seams under either a seat or up in the bow. Also, I needed to be sure that I kept the pieces small enough that were still manageable to work with. In addition to the working size of the 1708, I needed to keep my batch size of resin small so I'd not run out of working time with the resin before it would kick off and I could finish working it into the cloth. What I found to work best for me was to keep the sections of 1708 no longer than 6 feet at the most, and keeping my mixed resin to 8 to 10 ounces at a time. With each layer of 1708 that I applied to the stringers, I was sure to change the length on them so the seams were offset. I did not want all my junction points and overlaps to be on top of one another for both strength and aesthetic reasons. With the 8-inch wide 1708, it takes several pieces to achieve one layer over the stringer. Now if I wanted to use one piece to cover both sides and the top of the stringer at once, I'd have to use a piece that is 20 to 22 inches wide. But I'd have to keep the length of those sections very short because I would still run into issues with the working time of the resin. Ideally, if you have multiple people helping to apply the cloth, mix, and work the resin in, this is possible to do in larger sections, which will create a nicer looking finished product. But since I was working alone, I needed to find a system that was easily workable by just myself. Working this tabbing up under the bow was by far the worst part of this job. Clearly there's no vertical room for me to be upright. I had to find a way to see what I was doing, hold myself up, and still use my arms to work. On top of that, I needed to be sure that I not lay in the wet resin that I just applied. I can tell you that just the space constraints that I dealt with up in the bow slowed down the progress of the lamination considerably. And my body took an absolute beating from working and crawling in and out of the bow. For my second layer of the 1708, I took the 8-inch wide piece and cut it down the middle, essentially giving me two 4-inch wide pieces. I also doubled the length of these pieces, which allowed me to keep working my targeted 8 ounces of resin. For the third and last layers, I went back to the full 8-inch wide pieces of 1708. But this time I wrapped them over the top of the stringers and down to the floor of the boat. Now this method of layup provided me with my desired 3 layers where the stringers met the hole, and it gave me 2 layers of 1708 up towards the top of the stringer. In a couple minutes I'll bring you guys up to my whiteboard and we will sketch out the stringers. I wanted to give you a good visual representation of how each layer of 1708 was applied, so you can see the final result and the big picture of how everything overlapped and was holding these stringers into the boat. Now it was the same process repeated on the second side. I kept the same lamination schedule and also kept all my seams and overlaps in the same locations. Now my entire focus at this point was just the tabbing work of the stringers. I paid no attention to the water drains at the back of the stringer where they intersect the transom, and my plan is to get the stringers fully tabbed in, let everything cure up, and we'll come back and address those later. Now in the process of laminating both of these stringers in, I used the better part of an entire roll of the 8-inch 1708 and over 2 gallons of the vinyl ester resin. Now for reference, my stringers are 16 feet long and my boat overall is about 20.5 feet long, which is quite a bit longer than your typical jet boat. But for those of you that are about to take this project on yourself, you'll know how long my stringers are, how much I used, and hopefully that'll help you plan for your projects. So one of the biggest things, or the main thing that I need to address today, is I need to go ahead and address the fiberglass, because when I mix it up and laminated these in, I only mixed it with the hardener and I did not put anything on to seal the surface and have the surface get cured on the fiberglass. So with the laminating resin, it stays a little soft and tacky on the outside, which is fine, but you need to go ahead and either re-laminate over it within 24 hours, or if it sits longer than that, you need to sand it down and then re-laminate it. Now the big difference, most of you guys know if you use that fiberglass that you get from like Home Depot, it has a wax additive on it, so when it cures, it's kind of waxy and smooth and shiny on top. And that wax is in there to go ahead and cause that fiberglass to fully cure on the surface. And anytime you need to go ahead and re-fiberglass over that, you have to sand that surface down, rough it up, and then go ahead and start building your layers over that. Whereas with this laminating fiberglass, as long as it's within 24 hours, I can just go right over the top and I don't need to laminate over that again. I'm going to sand down these stringers. I'm not going to be too aggressive, and that's going to do 2 things for me. There's a lot of little sharp edges where my layers overlaid, and it'll go ahead and smooth those out and have a nice smoother, cleaner finish. And then I'm going to go ahead and go back over it with a roller instead of a brush with the same vinyl ester resin with some of the additive in it to cure it on the surface. And then we're going to leave it as is while we finish the rest of the boat. I don't really want to get too carried away right now chasing the finish and the prettiness of these stringers. I'm going to get all the structure of this boat put back in, meaning I'm going to get the stringers in, the floors, the bulkheads,
the side bulkheads here on the gunnels for the fuel tank. I'm going to get all of that done and addressed, and then I'm going to come back and pretty everything up, because as I was expecting, as you add the layers around the wood, it kind of gets darker, and you're not going to be able to leave just this raw wood finish because it just starts getting ugly with the fiberglass work. So priority number one is just to go ahead and get these stringers essentially to a point where I consider them finished, and then we're going to move on to other parts of the boat. The second thing that I need to address before I go ahead and put on the final coat of resin on these stringers is the water drains. Now, I didn't bother with the water drains when I was tabbing these in. I just went over them, planning to come back and address this later. So you can see that I did some exploratory surgery on this side, and I drilled a hole and was able to drill through. But I need to go ahead and get those layers of fiberglass cleared out and everything smooth out so I have a nice transition, and also so the water can go ahead and run on the boat and under the wood. Previously my hole was up here and it was about a ½ inch up in the wood, and I didn't like that because the water would have to run through the wood, meaning if there's any crack or defect in the fiberglass resin, the water could get into the wood and eventually rot the stringer. So I moved my drains back here in the back corner, and I actually cut it so the water will drain on the boat, stay on the fiberglass, and the whole goal was to keep the water off of the wood. So obviously things got built up over here, and I need to go ahead and get this ground out and cleaned up and do that on both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and address those first, get the water drains taken care of, get everything cleaned up. Then I'm going to go and hit the stringers down, re-laminate over them, and we'll go from there. To remove the fiberglass tabbing that's covering the water drains, I ended up taking a die grinder with an aluminum carbide burr and ground it out to get my rough shape. I then switched to some sanding discs and some flap wheels to finalize the shape and finish the drain holes. After addressing the water drains, I ended up jumping back to my 3-inch roll lock on my die grinder with 24 grit. I used this to get the large burrs and sharp edges from my last layers of the 1708 addressed. I then moved back to my 6-inch DA with 40 grit sandpaper to sand and scuff all of the fiberglass that was on the stringers in preparation for the last coat of resin. Now there's a fine line in sanding the stringers down enough to get the proper surface finish for the next layer and not to remove so much material that I get into the glass and compromise the strength. Okay, so here's what we're left with after we went ahead and hit the stringers with some 40 grit sandpaper on my DA, and then went ahead and went over them with the vinyl ester resin with the wax additive this time, so that way the surface is fully cured. Now you can tell that it looks quite a bit better, much more of a finished product than it was before. Now that's for two main reasons. One of the main reasons is because I rolled everything on with a little 6-inch foam roller, so you have much more even coverage of the fiberglass resin going on, and it's more uniform and looks quite a bit better. And the other one is, you can see from where the burrs were on this layer that rolled over, I was able to go ahead and sand those down and smooth it out, and now it creates a much more finished looking product where it's a lot nicer and complete. Now in order to run enough resin over both of these stringers on both sides, I took 12 ounces of the vinyl ester resin, and like I said, I used the foam roller to roll it on, and it was getting pretty light back here, so I probably would have been okay with mixing up a little bit more resin. But just so you guys know, depending on the length of your stringers, that's what I use, so you can use that accounting for your project. Now there's another thing I wanted to mention on getting these stringers in and laminated. I had a small window of time off to get them laminated in, and it took me 2 full days per stringer to get them laminated in. Now with this vinyl ester resin that I have a 24-hour window where I can relayer over it without having to sand on it and re-prep it. So that meant within that period that I had off, I basically had to get these stringers fully laminated and done in 2 days. Now I was doing this project by myself. I did not have any extra help, which probably would have been nice now looking back on it. So I kept all the lengths of my fiberglass short and manageable, and I tried to keep the quantity of resin I was working with, again, about to 8 ounces, so that way it wasn't starting to kick off as I was putting everything in. But towards the end, it was actually giving me some troubles because I'll show you guys on the whiteboard with the lamination schedule that I'm gonna do, but I actually had some lifting that was starting to come up on the edge on the top of the stringer, and I didn't have enough time to continue to work it, or I didn't have enough time to let it cure, sand it, and then continue working on over it. So is what that ended up doing is that ended up creating a few little air pockets here on the top you can see on this edge, which is not ideal. You lose a little bit of strength with them, but all of these air pockets are just up here on the top edge where it rolls over because my last sheet ended right there. And it's not down here on the sides or where it meets the floor. And that's really where all our strength is. And really the areas we need to be worried about is right there. And luckily those areas were fine and I didn't have any trouble working the 1708 in on those spots that have that issue. So we're good there, but it's just one thing to keep in mind when you guys are starting to do your boats or your stringers. Either plan more time to get them in or have someone help you. If I would have had another person helping me on these where they could have been pre-soaking this 1708 and handing it to me in the boat, it would have expedited the whole process and it would have given me in the long run more time to work those problems out within the 2-day window I had. So either go ahead and plan on having more time or a helper and it'll help you avoid those little things. In the end, it's not that big of a deal because of the location on the top of the stringer. There's really not much strength that's needed there. And once I went ahead and hit everything with the sander and got those sharp burrs off, went over it with that last coat of glass that I had to do. In the end, it came out pretty good and it's not that big of a loss. But one thing I wanted to mention to you guys. Let's take a look at the water drains and see what we came up with after I cleaned them up. And you can see here that it cleaned up real nicely. I used just a die grinder with a carbide bit to go ahead and grind that out and reshape it. And I had to get into the glass here a little bit for where the thickness was from this tabbing to give it just a nice smooth transition. But you can see that I have nice, good, clean hole all the way through. And it's exactly what I was hoping to achieve with it, to where I can keep all the water essentially away from the wood of the stringer. So the water is just going to be going here, which is just the fiberglass of the boat, and draining through. Now I have these all the way at the rear because when the boat's in the water, this is the lowest point of the boat. So I'm just trying to get as much water as possible out of the outside of the stringers and back down to where the bilge pumps will be. I still need to go through and come in here and just work a little bit more fiberglass resin to make sure I have no more exposed wood, and also to make sure that I have no gaps from where the stringer wood goes to the transom and the floor of the boat. Again, really taking a lot of time and effort to be sure that I have no areas or points to where any water can seep into any of the wood of the boat. Really trying to be sure that I don't create any problems down the road, and this is a long-lasting repair. So I drew this picture here on this whiteboard so I can give you guys a better idea of how I went ahead and laminated in the stringers. Really wanted to give you a good visual so you knew what I did with each layer and how it all kind of ended up in the end. So on this picture here, this is essentially represents the outside of the boat. This will be the inside. This is the stringer here, and on this little kick here is where I had that strake, which is about 1.5 inches, 2 inches away from the wood of the stringer. So I had to take that into account. Now, when determining how you're going to lay up these stringers and fiberglass them in, really the best piece of advice I've ever gotten, and I think it's the best advice I can give to anybody, is just don't overcomplicate it. There's so many opinions on this. You can ask 20 people how to lay up fiberglass and tab in stringers, and I guarantee you're going to get 20 different answers. At the end of the day, is what I think really matters is making sure that you have the right material structurally and enough layers, and I think you're good no matter what width you decide to use or how you decide to apply those layers. So for me, I was targeting 3 total layers, and the most critical areas I was worried about was down here on the bottom in this 90 degree where the stringer is adhered to the boat. Up at the top, it's nice to encapsulate that stringer, and it does give everything a little bit more strength, but it's not as critical up there. I was really focused down here at the bottom. So for this entire project, I've been using 1708, and I had an entire roll of 8-inch wide mat, which I was using to tab the stringers in. So I'm going to show you how I went ahead and did that and got the 3 layers on the boat. So on my first layer, I took that 8-inch wide 1708, essentially folded it in half, and put it equally to where the halfway point of the width of that was in the corners. So I had basically equal amount of that fiberglass on the wood or the stringer, and then the equal amount on the floor of the boat. And on this side here at the strake, it did end up coming out and over a couple inches, which was completely fine. Now, that's essentially the first layer. And as what I did after that is I came back with another piece of 8-inch wide 1708, and I wrapped it over the top, up and over like so, and capped the stringer. Now, the way things worked out, I ended up having a little bit of overlap in between the two pieces, which was completely fine, and I essentially had one layer over the wood at this point. Now, my next layer that I ended up doing is I took that 8-inch wide 1708 and I actually cut it down the middle, so I had two 4-inch pieces. And I took those two 4-inch pieces and I again folded it in the middle to where I had 2 inches on the wood, 2 inches on the floor of the boat, and that ended up working like so. I don't know if you guys can see this green there. Like so, to where it doubled my layers on the bottom and it kind of matched up with the top, so I was pretty equal. Now again, like I mentioned, I was shooting for 3 layers down here on the bottom. I'm not so worried about everything at the top. So that's how this all played out. Now for my last layer, I took another piece of the 1708, but I left it in the full 8 inches again, and I started it at the middle point of the top of the stringer, and I ran it all the way down, and it came out onto the floor like so. And then on the other side, I did a little differently, which this is where it kind of came back and bit me, is I actually started this all the way over on the outer edge rather than in the middle, and wrapped it down, and it came up and it stopped right on the top of this kick right there on the strake. That's where that ended. Now, where I mentioned where I had the bubbles on the edge and where I was limited on time or help, and I had those little air pockets that I had to dress, that happened right here on these upper layers. I had to put this orange inner layer on, which is the 3rd layer, and it was still wet, and I had to apply this last layer over it. So when I was working this layer over that edge, it was pushing it up right here, and that's where I got those little air pockets I was showing you guys. So if I would have been able to have enough time to either let this one dry and then apply the last layer, it wouldn't have happened because this would have been firm enough to stay in place. But again, I had a small window. I just had 2 days. I didn't have enough time to let it sit and come back the next day, so I had to make it work. Now, I originally intended to have this purple piece tie in at the middle point with this orange piece, but actually, because the way it all worked out, it didn't really work well here on after it came down on the sides and kicked up on the side, because I didn't have enough to roll it over on the floor of the boat, so I ended up moving that over basically to where I have extra layers here. Again, not a big deal because all the strength I wanted was down here at the bottom where I wanted the 3 layers. But that's how that wound up working out for me. Again, all 8-inch wide, 1708, trying to get 3 layers down here in the corner. I essentially have 2 layers up top and 3 right there in that small section, but no strengths needed up there. Again, when it comes to how you laminate these up, don't overcomplicate it. Just get the layers that you need. Use structural fiberglass, use 1708, so don't be using like cloth or mat, and you'll be fine in the end. Now, if you have any questions on how many layers you want to do for your boat, you always can go and just go ahead and lay up a small section of your glass, and you can see here that I've just layered up 1 layer, 2 layers, 3, and 4, and this is all the same 1708. And it gives you an idea so you can see the thickness, which you're about a 1/16 of an inch thick with each layer. So you can see that, but you can also use that to kind of get a feel for how strong this is. So if you notice, I went and cut one side off, and what I'm left with is I have each piece with 1 layer, 2 layers, 3, and obviously 4. And what I can do with these is I can take these small pieces and just flex them and see, you know, 1 layer, it's pretty easy to bend. 2 layers, I can bend it, but it takes quite a bit more effort. On the 3 layers, I can barely bend it, but not really. And 4 is pretty much rock solid. So you can do this and make the judgment call on your boat on how many layers you want to use, depending on the size of the boat, how overkill you want to build it. If you're running a 1x6 stringer or some different wood, really, don't overcomplicate it. If you're wondering, I targeted 3 layers down here on the corners. I was comfortable with 3 based on the strength of my glass pieces. That's what I went with. Okay, that's gonna go ahead and cover it on getting these stringers installed and fiberglassed in. I hope that the information we covered in this video helps you guys with your projects. If you have any questions on what we did, why we did it, or how we did it, please drop them in the comment section below. I definitely will be keeping an eye on that and answering the questions you guys have. Now, also you guys are gonna notice that we got the boat turned around now. Definitely keep an eye out on the channel. The next video that I'm gonna have, we're gonna be covering the fuel tanks. If you guys remember when I took it apart, they were fiberglassed in and it was pretty rude and crude. I've devised a way where I can go ahead and get those fuel tanks in where they're fully bolt in. It's gonna look a lot better. I can service them, pull them in and out if I need to. So definitely keep an eye out for that video. It's gonna be pretty interesting and I got some good ideas I wanna share with you. If you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing to the channel. If you enjoyed this video, found it entertaining or helpful for your project, definitely let me know below. Share the video with your buddies that have jet boats. And guys, keep an eye on the channel. I have a lot more videos coming out on this boat. Appreciate you guys for watching this video all the way through. Thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.